The chandeliers were blazing. Couples spun across the marble floor, and there she was, standing alone in a pale blue gown, her fingers trembling on the rim of her glass. I don't know what came over me, but I set the mop aside and walked straight toward her. When I asked, "May I have this dance?" the entire ballroom went silent. The chandeliers looked like constellations lowered to eye level, each crystal catching 100 small suns and scattering them across gowns, polished marble, and silvered mirrors. The city's grandest charity gala hummed at full brightness. Violins softened the edges of conversation, photographers pulsed light like distant lightning, and waiters flowed through the room with the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. At the center of it all was a name that bent the room around it: Richard Sterling, host, benefactor, and the kind of corporate figure whose presence made even power feel underdressed. At the far edge of that lacquered world, a man repositioned a mop bucket so it would be invisible unless you were looking for it, and no one was. Daniel Hayes, 42, moved as if the marble itself might judge the sound of his steps. He had learned the craft of vanishing. Keep the corridors gleaming, the brass unspotted, the doorways free of fingerprints, and yourself smaller than the work you've done. A single father doesn't waste motion. He puts it where it matters. Tonight, that meant bathrooms, banisters, and the quiet dignity of staying out of the photographs. But invisibility has a cost. It asks you to swallow the reflex to look up, to pretend you don't notice the world that refuses to notice you. Daniel's eyes drifted anyway, human before hired, drawn toward the hush at the ballroom's edge where a young woman stood like the eye of a storm. Still, composed, somehow separate. Pale blue gown, dark hair falling in calm waves to her shoulders, chin tipped as if listening for something only she could hear. Clara Sterling. The name arrived in his mind a beat after the image, carried by 100 murmurs he wasn't meant to catch. She was the host's daughter, and she was blind. He wouldn't have known it from pity. Nothing about her posture asked for that. But the way her fingers traced the rim of a glass told a story Daniel recognized. The small circle people draw when they're finding their bearings in a room that has already decided who they are. He knew that circle. He'd watched his 10-year-old, Emily, draw versions of it at school fundraisers, sitting at the edge of a table while conversations lifted off without her. He felt the old tug in his chest, the protective ache that starts as a thought and ends as an oath. Be kind where the world is careless. Music brightened, applause rippled, money announced itself in the currency of gratitude. Daniel guided his tools farther into the shadows and let the orchestra brush past him like weather. He inventoried the room the way only workers do, where the tray would tip, which hinge would squeal, how long until the ice would sweat through the linen. And then, unavoidably, he inventoried himself. Worn shoes, good hands, a life that had narrowed since his wife died and simultaneously sharpened. Grief had stripped away every unimportant ambition and left behind one clear task: raise his daughter well. He could live with being unseen if it kept a roof over Emily's sleep. Across the floor, people spoke to Clara in the careful tones reserved for porcelain and prestige, and then drifted away when conversation demanded nuance instead of nicety. She stood there, patient, the set of her shoulders betraying the weight of being watched without truly being regarded. Daniel noticed the smallest things: how her cane rested against the wall within easy reach, how she angled her face toward the music as if mapping the room by sound, how the smile she offered a passing voice didn't reach her mouth in time to be caught. The orchestra began a waltz. Pairs flowed into form. Space thinned around her. Daniel adjusted a folded towel until its edges matched, an old habit when the mind wants to speak. He reminded himself why he was here. Clock in, do the job, keep it. Yet a second truth rose, a quieter one that had nothing to do with employment. The world, for all its polish, is built by hands like his. And sometimes the only rebellion left to ordinary people is attention. To refuse to let someone be alone when loneliness is the only thing the crowd agrees on. From his post behind the marble pillar, he let himself look one long, unhurried moment. He saw a young woman bracing against an ocean of sound, and he understood that bravery often looks like standing still. He exhaled slow. Somewhere in the music, he heard an old promise he'd made at a hospital bedside: to keep choosing decency even when it isn't returned, to keep showing up even when nobody claps. He centered the mop handle in his palm until it felt like a metronome. The night would get through its grandeur with or without him. But for the first time since he'd stepped into the ballroom, Daniel allowed a possibility to take shape, not of stepping into light, but of carrying it, briefly, to where it was needed. The waltz unfurled like silk, and the ballroom shifted into orbits, pairs finding their measured ellipses, skirts whispering, cufflinks catching starlight from the chandeliers. At the margin of all that motion, Clara stood with the attentive stillness of someone listening for a door in a wall. Her cane leaned against the marble, her fingers mapping the rim of her glass again and again, as if reassurance could be traced into being. The crowd flowed around her in courteous arcs, careful not to touch, careful not to engage. Courtesy can be the cleanest form of distance. Daniel watched the choreography everyone else pretended not to see. A man approached, offered a sentence shaped like kindness, then retreated before the second sentence could require thought. Two women admired the pale blue of Clara's gown as though talking to fabric. A junior executive rehearsed his greeting under his breath, then lost his nerve and checked his phone instead. Each moment was small, survivable, but smallness compounds. He knew how it feels when the room insists on relating to your condition instead of your person. He had seen that lesson attempt to land on Emily's shoulders, and he had thrown his back beneath it until she could breathe. He measured the distance, 10 paces across polished stone, a shorter path than the one between rolls. The mop handle warmed in his palm. It was easier, safer, to remain a fixture and let the music outlast the impulse. But impulses like this didn't arrive as noise for Daniel. They arrived as memory. The memory of a hospital fluorescent hum, of a hand-grown light in his, of a promise to meet the world where it was unkind and be different anyway. Go, the memory seemed to say, in his late wife's voice. The syllable not an instruction so much as a reminder of who he had already chosen to be. Clara shifted her weight. The smile she wore for the room faltered at its edges, then steadied, like a candle rebuking a draft. She angled her face toward the orchestra, mapping by sound. Violins to the left, cellos deeper, percussion distant, and beneath that, floorboards learning the pattern of movement through the soles of her shoes. Daniel noticed how she kept her shoulders squared, refusing the curl that invites sympathy. It wasn't stubbornness. It was authorship, a way to claim the paragraph of space she occupied and write herself into it as a subject, not an object. A whisper passed near him. Poor thing. Light as perfume, heavy as verdict. Another. Where's her father? The name Richard Sterling traveled on the air like a tidal, the man himself a gravitational body somewhere in the room. Daniel didn't look for him. He looked only at the young woman being narrated by strangers who wouldn't hand her the pen. He imagined Emily years from now, at some school dance, finding herself alone on a gym floor varnished to false gloss, and the thought landed like a hand on his shoulder, turning him gently toward action. He set the mop aside, aligning it with the bucket as precisely as he could, as if tidiness might grant him permission to cross a boundary not written down but fiercely policed. His heartbeat counted time with the strings. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The numbers steadied him. He rehearsed the single line he could offer that did not announce pity, superiority, or spectacle. Not, "Are you all right?" A question that makes the asked person prove their competence. Not, "Do you need help?" which puts need above personhood. Something simpler. A question that offered choice. A question that treated her as a participant in the night, not a problem within it. Clara's hand sought the cane, fingertips finding the familiar grip. She lifted it once, barely, tapping the floor as if to say, "I can navigate. I simply need a point from which to begin." The gesture was small, but in Daniel it moved a lever long prepared. He stepped from behind the pillar. At once the air changed, as if the room recognized a breach of assigned lanes. A waiter paused with a tray midair. A pair halted their turn to watch. The orchestra, mercifully, did not register the disruption. Music is better at ignoring class than people are. 3 paces in, Daniel almost stopped. He imagined the aftermath, a reprimand, a lost shift, the consequence he could not afford. Emily's backpack on the chair by their door. The bills lined like thin accusations on the counter. He tasted the copper of caution. Then he remembered Emily's laugh when she learned a new step in their tiny kitchen, her feet on his boots so she could feel the pattern. "Count for me, Dad," she had said. And he had. And the world had made sense for the length of one song. The memory fixed his next step, then the next. He approached the edge of Clara's hearing and stopped, leaving a breath's courtesy of space. He let silence arrive first so his voice wouldn't. Then, warm but ordinary, like asking the time at a bus stop, he said, "Hello." He watched the way the word reached her, how her head turned toward it, how her posture shifted from braced to conversational. He offered his name because names level a field. "I'm Daniel." Her face lifted by a fraction, listening not for status but for tone. He kept his own even, the way he spoke to Emily when the world asked too much. "I don't want to presume," he said, and meant it. "But if you're thinking about the floor and the music at the same time," he paused, not filling the space with explanation, "I could count. An invitation, nothing more. A way to place the choice in her hands where it belonged." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to lean in, that collective hush made of curiosity and skepticism. Clara's fingers loosened on the cane, then tightened again, not from fear. Daniel could see that now, but from calculation. She angled herself toward him, drawing a line from sound to presence. "Hello, Daniel," she answered, and the small smile she gave him was not for the audience. It was for the relief of being spoken to as she was. Between them, the waltz kept time. Around them, the gala performed itself. Within Daniel, the decision finished forming, not as defiance, but as fidelity to a promise older than the evening's grandeur. He inhaled, steady. "May I?" he began, the question ready to step into the light. The orchestra's swell lifted couples like waves, setting them adrift on the marble sea of the ballroom. Clara stood at its edge, the notes reaching her ears but not her feet, her grip tightening on her cane as if it might anchor her to the floor. Daniel, close enough now to catch the tremor in her shoulders, inhaled once, steadying himself. The line he had rehearsed in silence rose to his lips, fragile yet firm. "May I have this dance?" The words hovered, tender but unignorable, and for a suspended moment the air itself seemed to stiffen. Conversation stuttered. A waiter slowed mid-step. Gasps rippled outward as if the chandeliers themselves had whispered scandal into every jeweled ear. A janitor had crossed the invisible boundary and offered not pity, not service, but partnership. Clara tilted her head, surprise flickering in her expression. She had not seen the judgment-twisting faces around them, but she heard Daniel's voice clearly, uncoded by condescension, unshadowed by duty. She heard only the warmth, the invitation given to her as a woman, not as a spectacle. Her lips parted in the faintest smile. "Yes," she whispered, a single syllable that carried the weight of her choice. Daniel extended his arm, careful not to guide but to offer. Clara's hand found his, tentative at first, then firmer as trust settled between their palms. He led her toward the center, each step deliberate. The crowd shifted back, forming a ring of curiosity and disbelief. Faces leaned closer, eager to witness either miracle or mistake. Daniel kept his gaze ahead, not on them. His job had never been to please the crowd. It was to hold steady what mattered. Tonight, it was her. As they reached the dance floor, Clara's breath caught, and Daniel heard it. He lowered his voice to a rhythm she could follow. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. His chest rose and fell with the cadence, his steps measured to cradle hers within the music's flow. Clara listened, then moved, her gown brushing against his worn shoes. At first her steps were tentative, but Daniel's grip was steady, his count constant. Slowly, she found the pattern, her body remembering what the world too often denied her, that she could belong to its movements without apology. The murmurs dulled, replaced by silence so dense it hummed. Guests forgot their champagne, their whispered commentary. Even the waitstaff froze, trays balanced in suspended service. Clara turned, her hair brushing her cheek as she followed his lead. Daniel's eyes softened, not with pride, but with relief. Relief that she trusted him enough to let the music carry her. She laughed, the sound unguarded, light spilling through a crack she had kept sealed against years of pity. Daniel's smile answered hers, quiet, almost boyish, as if the world had granted him a moment outside its script. Every rotation blurred the hierarchy the gala was built upon. Silk brushed against polyester, pearls against calloused hands. The distinction between host and hired dissolved into the simple geometry of two people in step with each other. Clara's smile widened, her cheeks flushed with the exhilaration of being seen, not managed. Daniel felt the gaze of the room like heat on his back, but he let it pass. For her, he would hold steady until the last note. The dance did not last long, 3 minutes perhaps, but within that span, the impossible became fact. A janitor guiding a CEO's blind daughter across a floor that had not been made for either of them. And when the music drew to its final chord, the applause that erupted was not the polite clatter of social obligation. It was genuine, startled, moved. Clara squeezed his hand, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "Thank you." For the first time that evening, Daniel allowed himself to believe that a moment of kindness could be larger than circumstance, larger than judgment, larger even than fear. The waltz carried them as though the music itself had drawn a circle of protection around their steps. Daniel counted softly, his voice the thread Clara followed. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. He kept his tone low, steady, almost like a lullaby, and Clara matched him with growing confidence. Each movement she made began cautiously, then settled into rhythm, until she was no longer just keeping pace. She was dancing. Her gown swirled in time with her turns, the pale blue fabric catching light and making her seem almost luminous against the polished marble. Daniel's hands were sure but gentle, guiding without insisting. He did not tug her forward or press her back. He gave her space, and with that space, dignity. Clara's smile widened, transforming her from a solitary figure at the edge of the ballroom into the center of it. She tilted her head, listening not only to the orchestra but to the certainty in his breathing, the confidence in the way he held her hand. Gasps had long faded into silence, but the silence was no longer judgmental. It was reverent. The crowd stood arrested, watching a scene no program had scheduled. The senators, the investors, the wives in diamonds, and the men in tuxedos, all had turned into witnesses. Even the violinists seemed to draw their bows with greater care, as if unwilling to break the spell that hovered over the hall. Clara spun once, laughter tumbling from her lips, light and clear. Daniel's answering smile deepened lines at the corners of his eyes, lines carved from years of labor and worry, but softened now by joy. For Daniel, the dance was more than a gesture of kindness. It was memory layered with meaning. He thought of Emily standing barefoot on his shoes, small hands clutching his arms while he taught her to waltz in their narrow kitchen. He remembered her laughter echoing against the chipped tiles, her trust in him absolute. Now, guiding Clara across the expanse of the Gala's ballroom, he felt the same responsibility, the vow to create safety in motion, to give someone enough steadiness that they could forget fear for a while. Clara felt it too. For the first time that evening, she wasn't the blind daughter set aside in corners, pitted from a distance, or whispered about with polite discomfort. She was a young woman moving in time with music, laughter rising in her chest because someone had asked her to dance instead of excusing her from it. She pressed her palm lightly against Daniel's shoulder to feel his rhythm more clearly, then matched it with a step that surprised even her. The confidence startled her into another laugh. "I didn't think I could," she whispered, "just for him." "You can," Daniel replied, steady and quiet. "You already are." Their words dissolved into the music, but the bond they wove in that exchange was unmissable. Around them, the audience no longer saw a janitor and a CEO's daughter. They saw connection, unpolished but undeniable. Whispers had stilled, replaced by something rarer, admiration that most were too proud to admit aloud. As the final chords swelled, Daniel slowed his steps, easing her into the last turn with deliberate grace. The music faded, leaving a silence so profound it was almost fragile. Then the applause came, not as scattered claps of obligation, but as a rising tide, genuine, wholehearted, stunned. Clara squeezed Daniel's hand, cheeks flushed, her breath quickened from both the dance and the courage it had required. She turned her face toward him and whispered, "Thank you." Daniel lowered his head slightly, as if bowing not only to her, but to the moment itself. For a heartbeat, he allowed himself to feel it fully, the pride, the relief, the reminder that even in a life built from work and loss, beauty could still find its way through. And yet, beneath that beauty, he felt the first tremor of unease. Somewhere in the crowd, he knew eyes sharper than applause were watching. The applause still rang when the air shifted. It was subtle at first, the kind of hush that spreads like a shadow across sunlight. Daniel felt it before he saw it. A tightening in the crowd, a ripple of unease, as though something powerful had begun to move through the room. Clara still smiled, her cheeks warm, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She had not seen the way eyes suddenly darted toward the entrance of the circle, but Daniel had. Richard Sterling was stepping forward. The CEO's presence was like a command all by itself. Conversations stilled. Waiters slowed, pivoted, and vanished toward the walls. Senators and investors parted, creating space without being asked. Richard moved with deliberate precision, his jaw taut, his polished shoes clicking against the marble like gavel strikes. Every inch of his posture carried authority, the authority of a man accustomed to being the center, not watching his daughter shine in someone else's arms. His gaze locked on Daniel, and in it was not only anger but something harder to name, fear, perhaps, or memory. Daniel Hayes. The voice sliced through the ballroom like steel drawn from a sheath. Gasps scattered, because this was not the rebuke of a stranger. It was the address of a man who already knew the janitor's name. The whispers doubled back on themselves. How does he know him? Why would he know him? Daniel felt Clara's hand stiffen in his, her body tense as if sensing the storm without needing to see it. He tightened his grip just briefly before letting go, not to abandon her, but to shield her from the weight about to fall on him. "Step away from my daughter," Richard commanded. His voice carried humiliation disguised as authority, the kind that made onlookers flush as though they themselves had been shamed. Daniel bowed his head slightly, swallowing the heat that rose to his face. He had lived long enough to know when to stand his ground and when survival meant bending. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice even, "I meant no disrespect." She looked like she needed, he faltered, unwilling to say someone. His throat tightened around the word. She needed kindness. Richard's hand cut the air, dismissive and sharp. Kindness. The word was spat out, hollowed into mockery. She needed a janitor to parade her in front of senators, investors, dignitaries? To make her a spectacle? His words landed heavy, cruel not because they were true, but because they carried the weight of social power. Clara flinched, the brightness she had carried only moments before dimming at the edges. "No, father." Her voice was soft, but it traveled across the hush like a thread of steel. She stood straighter, her cane resting and used by the wall, her chin lifted in defiance. "I needed someone to treat me like a person." And he did. The murmur that swept through the guests was not of amusement this time, but astonishment. It was rare for anyone to contradict Richard Sterling, rarer still his own daughter. Daniel felt a surge of admiration for her, and at the same time, guilt that his presence had provoked her into conflict with her father. He lowered his gaze. Pride warred with necessity. He wanted to stay, to defend what had been genuine between them. But another image rose unbidden, Emily's face. His daughter, waiting at home, depending on him to keep this job, to keep the rent paid, the lights on, the fridge full. He could not risk it, not for pride. "I'll leave," he said finally, his voice firm though his chest ached with the weight of it. He turned slightly, preparing to step away with the dignity he could still claim. But Richard's next words froze him in place. "You think you can walk away so easily? Do you believe I don't know who you are?" The ballroom tightened again, breathless. Daniel stopped mid-step, confusion threading his brow. He turned back slowly, the question hanging between them like a suspended blade. "What do you mean?" he asked. Richard's jaw worked once, twice, before he spoke, his tone cracking through the silence. "Tell them. Tell them why I know your name. Tell them the truth." The crowd's murmurs turned into a wave. Daniel stood rooted, his pulse hammering in his ears. Whatever was coming, it was larger than humiliation, larger than a dance. Clara's hand found his arm again, trembling, searching. "What truth?" Daniel asked, his voice low, his eyes locked on the man who seemed carved from stone. And Richard Sterling leaned forward, his expression hard, but beneath it flickered something no one had seen before: guilt. He drew in a breath and hurled the revelation into the room with the force of a verdict. "Because your daughter, Emily Hayes, is my granddaughter." The room erupted, the applause of moments ago replaced by cries of shock. Clara gasped. her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel staggered back as if struck. The ballroom that had once been a stage for music was now a courtroom, and the trial had only just begun. The room broke into chaos the way glass shatters. First a crack, then 100 sharp edges. Gasps overlapped into exclamations. Whispered names collided, and eyes darted between Daniel, Clara, and the Titan at the center of it all. Daniel stood stunned, as if the floor beneath the chandeliers had tilted, pitching him into a truth too heavy to carry. Clara's hand, small and trembling, clung to his sleeve as if to anchor him. She could not see the expressions painted on the crowd, but she heard their shock, and she felt his body stiffen with disbelief. "What are you saying?" Daniel's voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual calm. His face had gone pale, the words, "my granddaughter," still ringing in his ears. He had come to the gala as a janitor, invisible, anonymous. Now, with a single sentence, his life had been dragged under the spotlight. Richard Sterling did not flinch. His gaze was locked on Daniel, but the firmness in his eyes trembled with something that wasn't just anger. Guilt clung to him like an afterthought. "Years ago," he began, his voice carrying through the heavy hush, "before you married, before you became this man who scrubs my floors, my company made decisions. Ruthless ones, and lives were destroyed." His throat tightened as though he could taste the ash of those years. "One of those lives belonged to your late wife's family." Daniel's heart thudded painfully. He saw flashes of his wife's face, the way she had carried her burdens quietly, the nights she had sat at the kitchen table with bills stacked like a fortress around her. She had never told him everything. She had never told him this. Richard pressed on, each word heavier than the last. "When she sought help, when she begged me." For a moment, his voice cracked. He looked less like the unbreakable CEO and more like a man cornered by his own choices. "She was my daughter, too." The words detonated across the ballroom. Silence, then uproar. Clara reeled, her grip on Daniel's arm tightening until her knuckles whitened. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is Emily really my niece?" Daniel staggered under the weight of her question. His throat closed, his mind scrambling. He thought of Emily asleep in her small bed at home, unaware that her lineage had just been announced to a room of power and prestige. I never knew," he stammered. His voice cracked against the edges of disbelief. "She never told me." His chest ached, a bitter grief rising for the secrets his late wife had carried to her grave. "I thought you hated me," he said, staring at Richard. "I thought you despised me because I was nothing, because I was poor." The room was no longer just watching, they were devouring. Whispers hissed like wind. A janitor? Family? The CEO's secret daughter? The walls of wealth and hierarchy trembled as the truth rearranged them. Clara released a shuddering breath, then reached out again, her hand finding Daniel's. Her touch was steady now, anchoring him when the ground felt gone. Then tonight, her voice broke, but she pushed through. Tonight wasn't only about a dance. It was about family, about finding what was hidden in plain sight. Daniel's eyes burned, not from humiliation, but from the flood of emotions he had not allowed himself in years. Loss, betrayal, grief, but also, somewhere beneath it all, recognition. A truth he had never asked for, but could no longer deny. He bowed his head, the strength in his posture finally breaking. Richard Sterling stood rigid, his face ashen, the authority that once silenced rooms now unraveling into something more fragile. He had exposed the truth, but in doing so, he had exposed himself, his past failures, his guilt, and the cost of power when it chooses silence over mercy. The gala was no longer a celebration. It had transformed into a reckoning. And Daniel Hayes, once invisible, now stood as the axis of it all, a janitor, a father, a man bound by blood to the very family who had ignored him. The ballroom, moments ago glittering with easy laughter and polite applause, now seemed to pulse with an uneasy silence. The truth had broken through the chandelier's glow, scattering the night into fragments that could not be put back together. Daniel stood at the center of it, chest tight, his hands trembling despite the effort he made to hold them steady. He had scrubbed floors to survive, endured whispers to provide, raised his daughter in the shadow of grief, and now, before senators and magnates, he had been redefined. Not just janitor, not just widower. Family. Clara's hand remained in his, small and firm. Her face tilted toward him, though her eyes saw nothing of the room's swirling judgment. What she sensed was enough: the pounding of his pulse beneath his skin, the ragged edge of his breath. "Daniel," she whispered, voice taut with both wonder and sorrow, "we're connected. Emily, she's my blood too." The words trembled in the air, fragile but undeniable. He swallowed hard, struggling for words. Emily's face, smudged with playground dirt, framed by tangled hair, bright with laughter, flashed in his mind. His Emily, the girl who had asked him once, "Dad, do we have family besides us?" He had said no then, not to wound her, but because he believed it true. Now, he felt the sting of that memory, the correction forced upon him by a truth he hadn't chosen. "I never knew," he murmured, his voice breaking. "She never told me. I thought the world despised me because I was small, because I had nothing." But all this time, his voice drifted into silence. Richard Sterling, the man who had once dominated the room without effort, looked hollowed by his own revelation. His eyes, sharp with power, now flickered with something that weakened his stance: regret. "I hid it," he admitted, the words almost too soft for the vast space. "Your wife, my daughter, pleaded with me, but I turned away. I thought protecting my name mattered more than protecting her. I told myself it was business, but it was cowardice." He inhaled sharply, the sound ragged. "And I've carried that guilt every day." The audience, stunned into silence, dared not move. It was no longer about the dance, no longer about scandal or spectacle. It was about the reckoning of a man whose empire had been built on control and the quiet dignity of another who had lived without it but endured. Daniel lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Richard's across the gulf of marble and wealth. What he saw was not only anger but recognition. Two men bound by the same woman, one by blood, one by love, and now forever by a child neither could deny. Clara squeezed Daniel's hand again, her voice soft but unwavering. "Then tonight isn't about shame, Father. It isn't about appearances." Her words rang with quiet authority. "Tonight is about truth, about family finally finding each other." Daniel's throat burned with tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. He did not weep when bills piled high. He did not weep when he worked nights so Emily could have shoes that fit. He did not weep when loneliness pressed heavy in the hours after his wife's passing. But now, with Clara's hand steady in his, with Richard's confession hanging in the air, the tears brimmed. He let them. Not weakness, release. The crowd no longer looked at him as invisible. Their stares were heavy, but different now. Some filled with pity, some with awe, others with unease at the collapse of their careful hierarchies. A janitor was family to the Sterlings. No champagne toast could smooth that away. Clara leaned closer, her voice meant only for him. "You gave me something tonight no one else has. You treated me as I am. That makes you more than what they see." Her words anchored him. He nodded, unable to speak. For a moment, time held still. The three of them bound in a triangle of loss, regret, and the possibility of something new. The gala would end, the guests would leave, the headlines would spin. But none of that mattered compared to the truth that had been unearthed. Emily Hayes was both Daniel's daughter and Richard Sterling's granddaughter. And Clara, radiant even in her blindness, smiled as if she had just been given sight, not of the chandeliers above or the gowns around her, but of the bond that connected her to a family she had never known. The night had begun with music and wealth. It ended with revelation and blood. And in that revelation, Daniel understood something his late wife had carried silently. Family is not measured by status or spectacle, but by the ties that remain when secrets collapse.